Thank you, Anastasia. And indeed, time is short and pressing, so I'm going to pile right in. So I'm going to attempt to define a little bit what is the peril that perhaps sort of faces us, and then talk about the features of what a solution might look like. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and I'm going to look for the kind of show of hands, which might be a little challenging in this precise format. So who out there actually is sharing their data, their health data, on an ongoing basis? Very pertinent right now for the purposes of their own well-being, but also for their community. I don't see people bring out their hands. Who out there is sharing their financial data, their detailed financial data for the purposes of fueling greater financial product innovation, driving inclusivity? Also not many hands up there. But who knows full well that they're sharing their browsing data, and this is serving the needs of advertising revenue and of the e-commerce players. And indeed, that over and above the browsing data and their use of mobile apps, this might be used in the context of state surveillance. All that information might indeed be sold at a local or governmental nation-state level to manipulate our emotions for the purposes of an electoral result. And so I think what I found is that typically people are well aware that that's happening, and we call this the data dichotomy. That is to say that whilst we're using a lot of data, we're not using it for the greatest of purposes. And at the same time, there are incredible, significant fundamental projects for humanity that we could be pursuing that are left unaddressed. And there's yet more data that we could be putting to that purposes. And so we think this has occurred partly because of the suppression of the primacy of the individual and the overreach of institutions and the inadequacies of technology to date to be able to deal with that overreach. So what kind of institutions are we talking about? I can move along the slide there. So we're talking about, say, somewhat anachronistic ones, that's fair to say, that have maybe have trapped us somewhat in the empires they're building. And in many ways, you can think of this as the perennial struggle between the republic or res publica and the empire. And although arguably there is quite a vacuum in leadership in some of these institutions, I don't want to make it too personal, although indeed you could argue that President Trump gets through cabinet members even faster than Palpatine might get through Sith Lords, for those Star Wars fans out there. But let's, for the moment, start with central banks and the very significant topic of money. So, we would posit that there's very significant inequitable macroeconomic situation that persists there. If you look at the last 30 years, the richest 1% in the world are $20 trillion richer, and the bottom 50% are, in fact, $1 trillion poorer. And also, if you look in the longer term, the US dollar has debased by close to 99% of its value, and that's just even prior to COVID, in the last century. So income inequality is rife, store of value in fiat currency not terrifically great. If you look at this, at the media, there was an interesting article by Marana, the editor at the FT, actually talking about how you can perhaps allege that we have the formation of the first sort of US oligarch in the form of Zuckerberg. That is to say, somebody who is using their position close to power, proximate to power, and the alignment of the interests with those people in power in order to wrestle Croesus level profits away. So I think there are issues here because, whereas we get lured into social media, over time we become the product. And then, in fact, the objective of the platform is advertising revenue. And that we should remember that on these platforms, that perhaps, even though there is the right to speech, perhaps there is not the right to reach. And all of these dimensions are still vexing problems within the context of media. If we look at government, one could argue we've entered on a global basis now, not just in the US, an era of zero-sum politics. So it's all about America first, it's about profits first, it's about an adversarial approach to trade that has been sweeping the world, and divisive propaganda that kind of seeks to maintain the kind of populist leaders in power. And it is, this is not exactly the model of global collaboration that perhaps we could be seeing. And this has been brought to light into sharp relief, arguably, by the response to the pandemic in various nation states. So let's see what we can suggest might be a good way to rethink this. A lot of people in this community be very familiar with the concept of sound money, something that is deflationary, stable, frictionless, and fair, and decoupled from the arbitrary decisions of unelected bureaucrats. Something that can allow for better saving tendencies, maybe less consumerist tendencies also, and to avoid some of the moral hazards of major loans from banks or risky practices within banks. Then we've also got concept of sound media, or you might call it decentralized media, in an era when every person and every company is becoming a media company, has to get its narrative out there. And so this is perhaps, we can imagine that if we give people the tools to create the social media and the narratives they want, we might have a better situation than we have today. Bake in incentive structures, as we've seen from companies like Brave and Steam and indeed Reddit recently. And perhaps shift to a world where, rather than relying on fact-checking from people or through some of the existing corporations that specialize in this area, we can actually do it through a form of decentralized consensus around both, what constitutes truth and indeed what constitutes hate. And we can have all of this in a fully open space so that the data can be extracted. And then finally, in terms of the capitalist model and the government's of influence on that, we think that, and this was mentioned a year ago when I spoke at CogX, that there's an argument for a refresh, should we say, of capitalism, to make it more inclusive, to make it something that can reward various different stakeholders for solving very complex problems that face us today. And I think we can achieve that using some of the technologies that have been built. We think that boils down to a bit of a manifesto, to that one thing that can address the data dichotomy that I described. That is putting the control of data back into the hands of the individual for them to be able to manage their own privacy. And they can choose, when, where, to whom they share that data, hopefully for mutual benefit. And also, they will be able to remove that data from platforms and also allow for that data, that state about them, to be used in other applications as well to prevent, platform risk and platform lock-in. So, we boil that down into these three areas: privacy, purpose, i.e. mutual benefit for the community, and also portability. And so, what I think particularly interesting here is how do we build a new layer for data, a new data fabric, if you will, that facilitates the emergence of different communities and their behaviors and priorities, and doesn't trap one individual in one community or another, and allows them to interact in a very organic and emergent fashion. So taking that point of portability, the flip side of that, we would argue, is composability. And that's in terms of computer science, it's a challenging task to bring to life. It's something that Tim Berners-Lee conceived of in the context of the semantic web back at the turn of the century. And the good news is the story has been unfolding for a while. So if you go back to the romantic era of open source, you could argue is kind of this evolution of this commons-based peer production alternative to companies and to markets, that the first motivations were very ideological. The second motivation used the internet to sell a little bit of software and services to many people and to build a business out of that. But the time for Red Hat perhaps has passed. The third era we are in, and that open source software has been co-opted by very large companies who have seen, and the data, our personal data, has been trapped in those platforms. In this fourth era, we think we're moving to this position where you don't just have open source software, but you have this open source data and the execution of these live running services that are then reusable, composable in more complex applications. And we think this is particularly exciting. It's like, should we say, having a whole series of actual Lego bricks that you can build into something more complicated. And so to contrast it, I think the previous era was a bit like having the blueprint for the Lego brick, and then you had to kind of build it yourself and then get it up and running. So you've got them ready, made and ready to go. And so when you put those tools into the hands of individuals and their dreams, and they get innovative, they start combining those innovations, and you can really deliver something quite extraordinary. Like, for example, this rather tremendous spaceship, or indeed a model of a spaceship. And And indeed, worth mentioning, this is actually, of course, the craft that enabled the Death Star to be blown up and the Empire to be overthrown. Anyway, so not exactly on Crew Dragon level, but perhaps an inspiration to some future Elon Musks. If we get back to this kind of the industry and look concretely what's going on, we've been actually in the previous talk, Muirhead at Blockstack was talking a lot about some of the fundamental layers of the newly decentralized internet that have been laid down. On top of that, there's been a furious amount of invention in what's called, people tend to call the financial primitives within the DeFi arena, particularly on Ethereum. So what's exciting about that is that they are those running reusable components, those Lego bricks, if you will. And what's also exciting is that what's happening is not just that there's a new sector, not only just a new sector of decentralized and open finance, which is big enough in itself, but also that what we're seeing is a wave of new software that is, if you will, weaponized with the ability to make and keep a commitment, to keep a promise. And so we may see that moving into different sectors, like, for example, supply chain. We have an investment in Centrifuge, and during CogX, we've heard about both Centrifuge Chain and Tin Lake, and the ability to take real-world off-chain assets and use that as collateral in the DeFi ecosystem, underpinned by MakerDAO and a DAI stablecoin. So we think this is super, super exciting. How are we doing with all of this progress? Well, there's an accelerating progress of active wallets and DeFi, as you can see here, thank you to Dune Analytics, and the early signs are promising. But I think we should be realistic. There's still much to be dealt with. So I think we need more increased user focus and therefore better UX. We need to clearly prove and communicate the evidence that token-based business models are going to have growing effectiveness. We need to be selective about the problems we chase after. We'll talk about that. And then something that we've coined here is kind of MV Web 3, minimal viable Web 3, and then we need to get on with it. So let's do that. So this, and hats off to, and tip of the hat to the HelpDAO project, is an analysis of some of the challenges when you are composing an end-to-end service from underlying running primitives, of some of the challenges in the user experience that can come about. People being vexed by definitions of things like DAI, but also fee levels and so on and so forth. So, this needs to be improved, although there is clearly a tension between composability and the UX, but the work is going on. Here, this was actually a slide that I used last time. Actually, interestingly, since then, Amazon has gone up 40% in value. Would have been a good bet. Would also have been a good bet over the last 10 years. It's gone up 20x. Now, the point I want to make here, though, is that at the outset of Amazon back in '98, Jeff Bezos set an expectation with shareholders that there not only wouldn't be a dividend, there wouldn't be profit, and that everything would be plowed back into the network they were building, and that it would be plowed back into the margin for the customers and for servicing the suppliers and so on and so forth. So you can think of it in some senses as a minimal viable product for the economic democratic model, and where in some senses the underlying Amazon stock, especially if some of the stakeholders involved in Amazon as a business had bought some of it, could have been seen like a work token in the context of that decentralized corporation. And so you'll see over the coming weeks some more work that we've done around this and contrasting it come out. But we can contrast the equity that we've known of historically, the innovative approach of Amazon, and now these legally compliant sort of new forms of financial instrument in the form of tokens that are able to encompass more stakeholders more effectively, and also are connected directly to a much lower friction, global, inclusive distribution network for those instruments. So it's not just about tokens. We do also think that when you take together these services, you might be able to extract the data from one service, but it is also possible to combine them and create metadata that will give you some moat and defensibility. It will also be possible to have some defensibility through the sheer complexity of that work. And if you combine that with great UX and brand, we're optimistic that people will be able to, should we say, do some traditional rent seeking on top of these underlying components that themselves, should we say, are just free to use in the ecosystem. on this point about being selective about problems, so you could have looked at the statement and got very pessimistic about the prospect for computers, but it turns out that would have been unjustified. The same is true here. We have to be selective about the areas where the indubitable cost of decentralization are worthwhile, then it's economic to address a particular area with decentralization. And over time, those economics are going to shift. Both as decentralization gets cheaper, but also as we get better at hunting out the opportunities. There's a related point also, which is that if you think about all of the different technologies within Web3, be it incentive structures using native digital assets, or having a native ID for the users on your platform, or using non-fungible tokens, for example, for within your what you're building, you might want to just seize on one of those. And so we just recently made an investment where there's a collectible football card that is an NFT, an ERC-721 collectible card. That is the bit that's resident on the blockchain. Everything else is not on the blockchain. And I think that captures some of the essence of building an effective MVP, and that's what we need to do to make sure we get to market and work out whether we've got product market fit. And we can also adopt other technologies that aren't being used in Web3 in order to address the problems, because after all, it's the problems that we're trying to solve that we should be keeping front of mind. So at the end of the day, everything always needs a little push, a little urgency. I hope that I've been sufficiently urgent with this. This is actually the Lauf machine from somewhere between 1812 and 1816. The invention of this was catalyzed by a season of bad weather and an Indonesian volcano explosion. It then took another 60 years, actually, and going from a German to 3 more Englishmen and a Frenchman to get to what we would recognize perhaps as a bicycle. So I don't want to wait 60 years for Web3, but sometimes the crises like some of the ones we're facing right now can give us a push. And so, we would say that we've got lots of great experiments running and running fast. We now have added impetus to sort the sheep from the goats and get the right experiments really moving into deployment. And we should remember that the state, and in the form of DARPA, actually gave us the internet. It wasn't legal to the beginning of the early 90s. And that, that collaboration between state and the private sector is extremely powerful and potent, and has been through many generations of computing. And you can think in some senses of the kind of rails, the infrastructure that's been put down, and these new digital economies as forms of nation states that I think either can help improve the way society is allocating its resources and making its decisions such that we don't need another planet, or indeed get us to Mars, probably with Elon Musk's help. And hopefully that will mean that we'll be just set. Thanks very much.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.